Gunshots cracked through the winter air, splitting the silence of Redemption Creek like lightning through a summer sky. One, two, three shots in rapid succession, followed by the thunder of hooves and men shouting. Then silence. A silence so complete it seemed to swallow the world whole. Before I was sold for $3, I saw 5 men die. Ruth Adams stood at the frosted window of Harmon's general store, her breath creating ghosts against the glass. Outside, fresh snow blanketed the main street, pristine, except for the crimson stains now melting into scarlet pools. 3 bodies lay motionless where they fell. No one approached them. No one dared. A bitter wind rattled the window panes as Sheriff Miller finally emerged from the jailhouse, rifle in hand. Too late to do anything but count the dead. Ruth's fingers tightened around the small brass key hanging from a worn ribbon around her neck, the last remnant of a life that seemed to belong to someone else now. She was 19 years old, but her reflection showed eyes that had aged decades in mere months. Eyes that had seen too much. Golden brown hair pulled back so severely it made her cheekbones appear sharp as cut glass. Once those same cheeks had flushed with life as she taught piano to the children of Millfield's finest families. Before her uncle's gambling debts. Before the whiskey. Before everything changed. "You shouldn't be watching this, miss." Mr. Harmon gently pulled the curtain closed, severing her view of the bloodshed. His weathered face, creased with 70 years of hard living, held something like shame. No young lady should have to see such things. Ruth said nothing. There were no words adequate for what she'd seen or for what awaited her tomorrow. The poster tacked to the community board outside the Mercantile told the story in bold black letters. Unclaimed bride. Auction ends at noon. Below those words in smaller print, educated, virtuous, household trained, as though she were a horse or cattle to be sold at market. The brass key grew warm in her palm. 7 years ago, her mother had pressed it into her hand as consumption claimed her final breath. "It opens more than just a lock," she'd whispered. Ruth had never discovered what that meant. The piano had been sold to pay for the funeral. Whatever box or door the key might open had disappeared along with everything else. Night fell early in December, the darkness a heavy cloak over Redemption Creek. The town had earned its name after the war, when broken soldiers and desperate families pushed west, seeking a fresh start. Some found it. Others found only more sorrow. Ruth wasn't sure which awaited her. Back in her uncle's house, though it wouldn't be his much longer, Ruth packed the few belongings she could still claim as her own: a worn copy of Wordsworth's poetry, a hairbrush with several bristles missing, a faded daguerreotype of her mother seated at a grand piano, fingers poised above the keys, forever frozen in the moment before music. The floorboards creaked behind her. "You'll fetch a good price tomorrow." Her uncle's voice was slurred, the whiskey on his breath reaching her before his words did. "Pretty thing like you. Educated, too. Some man'll pay top dollar." Ruth didn't turn around. "I'm worth more than dollars, Uncle William." He laughed, a harsh sound like rusted metal. "Worth is what a man's willing to pay, girl. Nothing more." When he finally stumbled away, Ruth unclenched her fist to find half-moon indentations where her nails had cut into her palms. Little crescent moons of anger. She wondered how many such marks she'd carry before this was over. The auction block was a makeshift platform in the old barn at the edge of town. Once used for livestock, now repurposed for a different kind of sale. The winter fair buzzed around it, children laughing at puppet shows, men competing at knife throws, women bartering for preserves and quilts. As if nothing unusual were happening. As if a woman weren't being sold like chattel 20 paces away. Ruth stood beneath the crooked sign, shivering not from the cold, but from the weight of eyes upon her. The dress she wore was borrowed, once white, but now yellowed with age and too short at the wrists to hide the bruises her uncle's grip had left. Her mother's key hung hidden beneath the fabric pressed against her heart. Mayor Horace Harmon stood beside the platform, his silver hair catching the weak winter sunlight. Unlike the jubilant auctioneer who typically occupied this space, the mayor looked as though he were officiating a funeral rather than a sale. His eyes, the pale blue of a winter ski, wouldn't meet Ruth's. "Gentlemen," he began, his voice lacking the customary enthusiasm of an auctioneer. "We have before us Miss Ruth Adams, 19 years of age, educated as a music teacher." He paused, swallowing hard. "Bidding starts at $3. The crowd consisted mostly of ranch hands and miners, with a few shopkeepers and farmers mixed in. Faces Ruth recognized from town but had never spoken to. Men who now assessed her like a mare at auction, noting the slenderness of her waist, the curve of her hips beneath the threadbare dress. $3, someone called out. For a piano teacher, she got hands softer than a baby's bottom. What good is she on a homestead? Laughter rippled through the crowd. Ruth's cheeks burned, but she kept her gaze level, staring at the distant mountains beyond the town. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her humiliation. She can learn, another voice countered. I'll bid 3. In 350 came another call. The bidding continued, voices overlapping as the price climbed. $4, 5, 7. Ruth felt her breathing shallow, her vision narrowing to a pinpoint. This was happening. She was being sold to whichever man offered the highest price to do with as he pleased. And then a voice cut through the clamor, deep quiet but with an authority that silenced the crowd. $10. The barn fell silent. All heads turned toward the back where a tall figure stood apart from the others. Jedediah Stone stepped forward, and the crowd parted like water around a rock. He was not a man people stood close to if they could help it. The stories about him were whispered in the saloon after too many drinks, tales of a Union scout turned bounty hunter who could track a man through a blizzard and bring him back dead or alive depending on the price offered. The scar that ran from his left temple to the corner of his mouth gleamed white against his sun-darkened skin. They said he'd earned it at Gettysburg, where half his unit had been slaughtered. Others claimed it came later, hunting a murderer through the Ozarks. No one knew for certain, and no one dared ask. Now at 38, Jed Stone's presence in Redemption Creek was a mystery that fueled endless speculation. He owned a cabin 5 miles outside town, came in for supplies once a month, and spoke only when necessary. Many mothers pulled their children closer when he passed. Men nodded respectfully, but kept their distance. $10, Mayor Harmon repeated, relief and confusion battling in his expression. Going once. The crowd remained silent. No one challenged Stone's bid. Going twice. Ruth's heart hammered against her ribs. Of all the men who might have purchased her, this scarred, solitary hunter was perhaps the most terrifying prospect. Sold, Harmon declared to Mr. Stone for $10. Ruth closed her eyes briefly. Her fate was sealed. When she opened them again, Stone had approached the platform and was counting coins into the mayor's palm. His movements were deliberate, unhurried. The collar of his long coat was turned up against the cold, and his hat shadowed his eyes. The transaction complete, everyone waited for him to claim his purchase, to take Ruth's arm and lead her away to whatever life he had planned for her. Instead, Jedediah Stone did something no one expected. He knelt. Right there in the dirt before the platform, one knee in the mud, this formidable man lowered himself before Ruth. The barn fell into shocked silence. No one moved. No one seemed to breathe. Ruth stared down at him, uncomprehending. His head was bowed, the brim of his hat hiding his face. Then slowly he reached for her feet. With calloused hands that had surely taken lives, he gently untied the fraying laces of her dust-caked boots. His fingers brushed her ankles with unexpected tenderness as he loosened the worn leather. When he spoke, his voice was so quiet only she could hear. You don't belong to me, he said. I just paid so no one else could hurt you. Ruth's breath caught in her throat. The moment stretched between them, fragile as a thread of spider silk. From the corner of her eye, she saw Mayor Harmon discreetly wipe moisture from his weathered cheek. Stone rose to his full height, meeting her gaze directly for the first time. His eyes were gray as gunmetal, but held something she hadn't expected, not possession or triumph, but a quiet certainty. You have a choice, he said loud enough now for others to hear. You can walk away. The debt is paid either way. A murmur rippled through the crowd. This wasn't how these transactions were supposed to end. The men who'd been outbid shifted restlessly, angry at being denied what they'd come for. Ruth stared at him, searching for deception in those gray eyes and finding none. Why, she whispered. He didn't answer. Instead, he turned to the mayor and nodded once, then walked toward the barn door, his long coat billowing slightly in the cold draft. Ruth stood frozen on the platform, uncertain what to do. Freedom stretched before her, a gift she'd never expected. But freedom to what, to where, with no money, no home, no protection, in a town where her value had just been assessed at $10. He's a devil, someone muttered nearby, probably cursed. You'd best run the other way, girl. Another voice countered. Fool spent good money for nothing. The murmurs grew, surrounding Ruth like buzzing insects. Before she could think better of it, she stepped down from the platform and followed Stone's retreating figure. Outside, the winter air bit at her face. Stone stood beside a sturdy wagon already loaded with supplies. He didn't seem surprised when she approached, merely inclined his head slightly. "You decided," he observed. "I have nowhere else to go," she admitted. He nodded once and offered his hand to help her onto the wagon seat. His grip was firm, but not tight, supporting without constraining. When she was settled, he placed a heavy wool blanket across her lap before climbing up beside her. As the wagon pulled away from town, Ruth felt the stares of townspeople following them. Whatever awaited her with this taciturn stranger, she had chosen it over the known cruelty of remaining behind. They traveled in silence for nearly an hour, the only sounds the creak of the wagon wheels and the steady breathing of the horses. Snow began to fall in lazy, fat flakes that caught on Ruth's eyelashes and melted on her cheeks like tears. "Why did you do that?" she finally asked. "Pay for me only to set me free." Stone kept his eyes on the trail ahead. "Freedom isn't something that should be bought or sold." "But you bought me." "No," his voice was firm. "I stopped a sale. There's a difference, Imam." Ruth studied his profile, the strong jaw, the scar that pulled slightly at the corner of his mouth, the lines etched around his eyes that spoke of years in the sun and wind. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now," he said, "you decide what you want your life to be." The simplicity of his answer stunned her, as if choice were that easy, as if years of being told her worth lay in her usefulness to others could be shed like an unwanted coat. "And if I don't know," his shoulders lifted in a slight shrug, "then you figure it out a day at a time." The wagon crested a hill and Ruth caught her first glimpse of Stone's cabin. It sat in a small clearing surrounded by pine trees with smoke curling from its stone chimney. Not the rough shelter she'd imagined, but a proper home, modest but well-maintained, with curtained windows and a covered porch. "You'll have your own room," he said as they approached. "Lock on the door. I'll sleep in the lean-to out back until spring." Ruth turned to him, startled. "I can't take your home." "You're not taking anything," he interrupted. "I'm offering. Different thing altogether." As they drew closer, Ruth noticed details that surprised her: a small garden plot now dormant under snow, stacked firewood neatly arranged against one wall, a rocking chair on the porch. Not the dwelling of a vagabond or a man who lived only to hunt. Stone brought the wagon to a halt and climbed down, then reached up to help Ruth. Her legs were stiff from the cold and the long ride, and she stumbled slightly as her feet touched the ground. His hand steadied her, then immediately released her once she was balanced. "I don't understand," she said, looking from him to the cabin and back. "What do you want from me?" Something flickered in his gray eyes, perhaps sadness, perhaps resignation. "Nothing you don't choose to give," he answered. "You can stay until you find somewhere else to go, or you can make a home here. Either way, the choice is yours." With that, he turned and began unloading supplies from the wagon, leaving Ruth to wonder if she'd stepped from one incomprehensible situation into another. The cabin's interior was as surprising as its exterior. A fire crackled in the stone hearth, casting golden light over simple but comfortable furnishings. Bookshelves lined one wall, filled with volumes whose titles Ruth couldn't make out in the dim light. A small table with two chairs stood near the hearth. Everything was clean, orderly. In one corner sat something that made Ruth's breath catch: an old violin case, closed, but prominently displayed on a shelf of its own. "You play?" she asked, nodding toward the instrument. Stone glanced at it, his expression unreadable. "Not anymore," he said, then gestured toward a door at the back of the main room. "That's your chamber. There's water in the pitcher if you want to wash. I'll prepare something to eat." Left alone in the small bedroom, Ruth took stock of her surroundings. A narrow bed with a quilt that looked handmade, a chest for clothing, a small table with a basin and pitcher, and most surprising of all, a tiny bookshelf with perhaps a dozen volumes. She poured water into the basin and washed her face and hands, the cold liquid shocking against her skin. In the small mirror above the basin, her reflection looked pale, wary, a stranger wearing her features. When she returned to the main room, Stone was at the stove, his back to her, as he stirred something in a pot. The domestic scene was so at odds with his fearsome reputation that Ruth almost laughed. "Almost. Do you cook often?" she asked, if only to break the silence. Every day, he replied without turning. Man has to eat. I can help, she offered, with cooking and other things if I'm to stay for a while. Now he did turn, regarding her with that steady gaze. You don't need to earn your keep. This isn't an exchange. Then what is it? The question escaped before she could stop it. Stone was quiet for a long moment, his attention returning to the pot on the stove. A correction, he finally said. Something set right that was wrong. They ate a simple meal of stew and cornbread, sitting across from each other at the small table. The food was surprisingly good, the stew rich with vegetables and tender meat, the cornbread sweet at the edges. You cook better than my uncle ever did, Ruth said, breaking the silence that had fallen between them. Not much of a compliment from what I gather. She looked up, surprised by the hint of dry humor in his voice. No, I suppose not. After they'd eaten, Stone cleared the dishes despite Ruth's protest that she could do it. You're tired, he said simply. Rest. Tomorrow's soon enough to figure out how things will work. That night, behind the locked door of her new room, Ruth lay awake listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the cabin, the pop and hiss of the fire, the creak of wooden beams settling the distant howl of a coyote. Somewhere outside, Stone was sleeping in the unheated lean-to, having given up his home to a woman he'd purchased but claimed not to own. None of it made sense. Men didn't act this way. They took what they paid for. Her fingers found the brass key hanging at her throat. It opens more than just a lock, her mother had said. Ruth wondered if perhaps she was beginning to understand what that meant. Ruth woke to the scent of coffee and the soft sound of chopping wood. Sunlight streamed through the small window of her room, casting patterns on the rough wooden floor. For a moment, she didn't remember where she was. Then yesterday's events came rushing back, the auction Stone's unexpected intervention, the journey to this isolated cabin. She dressed quickly in the same clothes she'd worn yesterday, the only ones she had, and stepped into the main room. A pot of coffee sat on the stove still hot, and a plate with 2 biscuits waited on the table. Of Stone himself there was no sign, but the rhythmic thunk of an axe outside told her where he was. After eating, Ruth explored the cabin more thoroughly. The bookshelves held an eclectic collection, military histories, medical texts, poetry, even a few novels. One volume in particular caught her eye, a worn copy of Thoreau's Walden, its spine cracked from frequent reading. The violin case drew her attention again. Unable to resist, she carefully opened it. Inside lay a beautiful instrument, the wood gleaming with the patina that comes only from years of loving use. But when Ruth touched the strings, she found them slack, untightened, an instrument deliberately silenced. The front door opened, and Ruth quickly closed the case, feeling like an intruder. Stone entered with an armload of firewood, his breath visible in the cold air that rushed in with him. I wasn't prying, she said quickly. He set the wood beside the hearth. It's not a secret, just a memory. You said you don't play anymore. No, Em. The single word held finality. Ruth changed the subject. Thank you for breakfast, and for, she gestured vaguely around them. All of this. Stone nodded once, acknowledging her thanks without comment. He removed his heavy coat and hung it by the door, revealing a faded blue shirt beneath. For a man who lived alone miles from town, he was surprisingly neat in his appearance. There's more coffee if you want it, he said, pouring himself a cup. We should discuss practical matters. Practical matters, Ruth repeated, taking a seat at the table. He remained standing, cup in hand. You need clothes, proper winter boots. I'll go to town tomorrow, get what you need. I have no money. You don't need any. Ruth felt a flare of familiar apprehension. I told you I won't be indebted. It's not debt, he interrupted. It's necessity. Winter in these parts isn't something to face unprepared. She wanted to argue but couldn't deny the logic. Her thin dress and worn boots wouldn't protect her from the Montana winter. Still, accepting charity, especially from a man who'd already done far more than expected, didn't sit right. I could teach, she said suddenly, piano or reading arithmetic, to earn my way. Something like respect flickered across Stone's face. Not many pianos in these hills, he observed. But there's the Wilsons, 5 miles west. They might value lessons for their grandchildren when they visit. You'd take me there to ask, he nodded, when the weather permits. Old Theodore's got a bad leg. Doesn't travel much in winter. His wife Martha might welcome a visitor, though. Ruth felt a small flame of hope ignite within her. Teaching again, doing something she loved, something that gave her value beyond her gender or her body, seemed like a dream too fragile to trust. For now, Stone continued, there's plenty to do here. Firewood to stack, preserves to inventory. If you want to contribute, I won't stop you. The day passed in a rhythm of shared work. Stone showed Ruth the root cellar beneath the cabin where vegetables and preserves were stored for winter. He taught her how to judge which logs were best for different purposes, pine for quick, hot fires, oak for long burning heat through the night. They spoke little, but the silence wasn't uncomfortable. Ruth found herself relaxing, if not fully trusting. By evening, when they again sat across from each other at the small table, she felt a tentative peace settle over her. May I ask you something? She ventured as they ate. Stone inclined his head, slightly permission granted. Why do you live out here so far from town? He took his time answering, his eyes on the flames in the hearth. Town has too many voices, he finally said. Too many eyes. Out here, the only judgment comes from the mountains and the skin. Ruth considered this. And what do they judge you for? His gaze shifted to her, sharp and assessing. What makes you think I'm judged? Everyone is, she replied simply, some more harshly than others. Something that might have been a smile touched the corner of his mouth, though it didn't reach his eyes. You're observant, Miss Adams. Ruth, she corrected, if we're to live under the same roof, even temporarily, Miss Adams seems overly formal. He nodded once. Ruth, then. After dinner, Stone took paper and pencil from a drawer and sat in the chair by the fire. The scratch of his pencil against paper was the only sound for nearly an hour. Ruth, curled in the other chair with a book from his shelf, watched him covertly. His face in profile was stern, concentrated, the scar a silver line in the firelight. His hand moved steadily across the paper, but whatever he wrote or drew, he kept angled away from her view. Later, as Ruth prepared for bed, she heard him leave the cabin. Through her small window, she saw him walking toward the lean-to, a folded paper in his hand. He paused at the door, looking up at the night sky for a long moment before disappearing inside. She slept better that night, exhaustion from the day's physical work overcoming her lingering weariness. Just before dawn, however, she woke to a sound that pierced the cabin's quiet, a man's voice, low and anguished, calling out a single word. Thomas. Ruth sat up, heart pounding. The cry came again, then subsided into silence. A nightmare, she realized. Stone was having a nightmare. She remained awake, listening, but heard nothing more. When she rose at first light, Stone was already at the stove, coffee brewing. If he remembered his night terror, his face showed no sign of it. I thought we might visit the Wilsons today, he said without preamble. Weather's holding. Ruth nodded, grateful for the prospect of meeting other people, especially a woman. For all Stone's unexpected decency, she'd feel better knowing there were others nearby she could turn to if needed. The Wilson homestead was indeed about 5 miles west, a journey they made on horseback rather than by wagon. Ruth rode behind Stone, careful to maintain as much distance as the saddle allowed, her hands resting lightly on his coat, rather than embracing him fully. The trail wound through pine forests and across small frozen streams. Despite the cold, the ride was beautiful, the landscape pristine under its blanket of snow. When they crested a hill and the Wilson place came into view, Ruth felt a surprising pang of appreciation for this wild, untamed country. The homestead was larger than Stone's cabin, a proper farmhouse with a barn and several outbuildings. Smoke rose from the chimney, and as they approached, the door opened to reveal an elderly woman wrapped in a shawl. Jedediah Stone, the woman called, her voice strong despite her years. Twice in 1 month, the world must be ending. Stone dismounted and helped Ruth down before answering. Mrs. Wilson, brought someone you might like to meet. Martha Wilson was small but sturdy, with white hair braided and coiled at the nape of her neck and eyes sharp as a hawk's. Those eyes took in Ruth's appearance, the too thin dress, the borrowed coat that hung past her fingertips, the unmistakable wariness of a woman in uncertain circumstances. Well, she said after a moment, any friend of Stone's is welcome here. Come in before you freeze. The farmhouse interior was warm and cluttered in the way of homes long lived in and well loved. A fire roared in a stone hearth twice the size of Stone's. Braided rugs covered plank floors and shelves overflowed with books, knickknacks, and preserved food. Theodore Wilson sat in a chair near the fire, his right leg extended before him on a footstool. He was a bear of a man gone slightly to seed with a full white beard and hands that spoke of decades of hard work. "Stone," he greeted, not rising. "And who's this you've brought?" "Ruth Adams," Stone replied. "New to these parts." Ruth stepped forward. "It's a pleasure to meet you both." Martha bustled about, insisting they sit, bringing coffee and slices of apple cake still warm from the oven. As they ate, Stone explained Ruth's situation, or a version of it, that emphasized her skills as a teacher and downplayed the circumstances of the auction. "A piano teacher," Martha exclaimed. "Mercy, we haven't had music in this house since our daughter visited last spring. Theodore used to play the fiddle before his leg got bad." "Wasn't much good even then," the old man grunted, but his eyes twinkled. "Could scare the crows, though." Ruth found herself smiling for what felt like the first time in months. There was something about the elderly couple that put her at ease, perhaps their obvious affection for each other, or the way they treated Stone with neither fear nor excessive deference. "Our grandchildren come stay with us each summer," Martha continued. "Three of them, all wild as March hares. Couldn't get them to sit still for lessons if you tied them down. But Elsie, that's our daughter. She's always saying they need more education than they get at that little school in Helena." "I'd be happy to teach them," Ruth offered. "Reading, writing, arithmetic. And piano if you have an instrument." "Had a small organ once," Theodore said. "Sold it years back when the drought came." "But the church in town has a piano," Martha added. "No one to play it since Reverend Phillips moved on. Buildings still sound, just no permanent preacher." Stone, who had been quiet during this exchange, spoke up. "Ruth could use it to practice. Maybe offer lessons there." The conversation continued, plans taking shape. By the time they prepared to leave, Ruth had a standing invitation to visit the Wilsons whenever she wished, and the prospect of students come spring. As they rode back toward Stone's cabin, Ruth felt lighter than she had in months. The future still loomed uncertain, but for the first time possibilities stretched before her that didn't end in degradation or despair. "Thank you," she said to Stone's back, "for introducing me to them." "The Wilsons are good people," he replied. "Known them since I came to these parts." "How long ago was that?" 5 years, give or take." "After the war," she ventured. His shoulders stiffened slightly. "After." They rode in silence for a while, the only sounds the creak of saddle leather and the soft thud of hooves on packed snow. Ruth gathered her courage to ask the question that had been bothering her since dawn. "Who is Thomas?" Stone reined the horse to an abrupt halt. When he spoke, his voice was tight. "Where did you hear that name?" "You called out in your sleep last night." He was silent for so long Ruth thought he might not answer. When he did, his voice was controlled, each word measured. "My son." The simple statement hung in the air between them. Ruth hadn't expected this answer, had imagined perhaps a fallen comrade, a brother, a friend, not a child. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "I shouldn't have asked." Stone urged the horse forward again. "You didn't know." They rode the rest of the way in silence, but it was a different quality of quiet, now heavier, charged with unspoken grief. Back at the cabin, Stone tended to the horse while Ruth went inside to start dinner. As she worked, her mind turned over this new piece of information. Stone had a son, or had had one. The anguish in his cries suggested the boy was lost to him somehow. It explained certain things: the care with which the cabin was maintained, the extra room that was now hers, perhaps even the silenced violin. A home prepared for a family that never materialized, or one that had been broken. When Stone finally came inside, he moved with the careful precision of a man holding himself together through force of will. He hung his coat, washed his hands, and took his seat at the table without a word. They ate in silence, but as Ruth cleared the dishes, she made a decision. Setting them aside, she turned to face him. "I lost my mother when I was 12, she said. "Consumption. She was a music teacher, to piano mostly, but she sang like an angel. At least, that's how I remember it." Stone looked up, surprise evident in his gray eyes. "After she died, my father remarried quickly. His new wife had no use for another woman's child, especially one who reminded everyone of what they'd lost. When I was 15, they sent me to live with my uncle." Ruth's voice remained steady, though the memory still had power to wound. "He was kind at first, until the drinking got worse, until the debts piled up." Stone watched her, his expression unreadable. "I'm telling you this," Ruth continued, Because loss leaves marks on us all, some visible, some not. She gestured vaguely toward the scar on his face. I don't know what happened to your son, and you don't have to tell me, but I understand grief, how it can hollow you out and still leave you standing. For a long moment, Stone said nothing. Then he was 4. Ruth waited, not pushing. Fever took him and his mother both. Emily. Stone's voice was flat, as if emotion would break him. I was away, hunting a man for the bounty. By the time I got back, they were already in the ground. I'm sorry, Ruth said the words inadequate but sincere. Stone nodded once, a sharp jerk of his head. Then he rose and went to the door, taking his coat. Need to check the lean-to roof. Snow's heavy. After he left, Ruth stood in the quiet cabin, aware she'd glimpsed something few people ever saw, the wounded heart beneath Jedediah Stone's formidable exterior. A heart still beating, still bleeding for those he'd lost. She moved to the bookshelf and carefully opened the violin case again. The silent instrument lay waiting, its strings loose but intact. On an impulse, she reached out and plucked one string. The sound was dull off-key, but it vibrated through the stillness like a question waiting to be answered. Days passed, falling into a rhythm of shared work and cautious coexistence. Stone went hunting, returning with rabbits or a deer that would see them through weeks of winter. Ruth learned to skin and prepare the game, her initial squeamishness giving way to practical necessity. They spoke more, though never again, of Thomas or Emily. Stone asked about Ruth's life before Redemption Creek, her education, her teaching, the books she'd read, and music she'd played. She in turn learned fragments of his past, his childhood in Pennsylvania, his service as a Union scout during the war, his drift westward afterward. What he didn't speak of was his time as a bounty hunter, though Ruth knew from town gossip that his reputation in that regard was fearsome. She didn't press. Everyone had aspects of themselves they preferred to keep hidden. One evening, while Stone was out checking his trap lines, Ruth noticed a loose floorboard near the hearth. Curious, she knelt and lifted it, discovering a small space beneath. Inside lay a folded piece of paper. The same paper she realized that Stone wrote on each night before taking it to the lean-to. She shouldn't look. It wasn't her business, wasn't her right. But her fingers reached for it anyway, unfolding the worn sheet with gentle care. It was a letter addressed to Thomas, dated 3 years earlier. Son, the mountains are white with snow tonight. The kind you used to say looked like the frosting your mother put on birthday cakes. I think you would be 8 now. Tall maybe, with your mother's eyes and laugh. I found your coat today, the one with the wooden buttons. Too small for you now, but I keep it anyway. Some days I think I hear you in the next room. Some nights I wake thinking you have called for me. I'm still looking. I know what the doctor said, what the town said, but I can't stop looking for you. Your father, Ruth, carefully refolded the letter and returned it to its hiding place. Her vision blurred with tears. The implications were staggering. Stone didn't believe his son was dead. Despite what others had told him, despite the years that had passed, he was still searching. It explained his solitary life, his location outside town, perhaps even his decision to rescue her, a commitment to preserving innocence in a world that had taken his child. When Stone returned that evening, Ruth couldn't meet his eyes, afraid he would somehow know she'd seen his private grief. But he seemed preoccupied, moving about the cabin with unusual restlessness. Storm's coming, he said, glancing out the window where darkness had already fallen. Bad one. How can you tell? Ruth asked. Air feels different. Animals are quiet. He stoked the fire higher. We should bring in extra wood. Might be snowed in for days. They worked together to stack firewood inside Stone, making multiple trips to the woodpile, while Ruth arranged the logs near the hearth. The wind had picked up, moaning around the cabin's corners like a living thing. Is the lean-to going to be warm enough? Ruth asked as Stone prepared to go out one last time. He paused at the door. I've weathered worse. But Ruth shook her head. This is ridiculous. Your home has enough space for both of us to sleep comfortably without you freezing in an unheated shed. I trust you won't. She faltered, unable to find delicate words. I gave my word, Stone said quietly. You're safe here. I know, Ruth replied, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. That's why I'm saying you should sleep by the fire tonight. I'll keep my door locked if it makes you more comfortable, but I won't have your death from exposure on my conscience. Something like amusement flickered in his eyes. Mighty concern for a man you barely know. And I know enough, she said firmly. The storm hit just after midnight, a howling fury that rattled the windows and sent snow swirling down the chimney to hiss in the flames. Ruth lay awake in her bed, listening to the wind's rage and the occasional creak of floorboards as Stone moved about in the main room. She'd almost drifted to sleep when a different sound cut through the storm's roar, a sharp rapping at the cabin door. Ruth sat up, heart pounding. Who would be out in such weather? She heard Stone rise, the soft thud of his footsteps crossing to the door, the creak of hinges, then silence. Curious and concerned, Ruth wrapped a blanket around her shoulders and opened her bedroom door a crack. The scene that greeted her froze her in place. Stone stood in the open doorway, snow swirling around him, staring down at a small figure huddled on the threshold. A child, a boy no more than 7 or 8, his clothing inadequate for the blizzard, his face blue-tinged with cold. "Please," the boy whispered, his voice nearly lost in the wind's howl. "Help!" Stone didn't move for a long moment, his tall frame rigid with shock. Then with sudden urgency, he scooped the child into his arms and kicked the door closed against the storm. "Ruth," he called, his voice tight with tension. "I need help." She rushed forward, the blanket falling from her shoulders as she took in the situation. The boy was semi-conscious, his clothes soaked through his small body, shivering violently. "Get those wet things off him," Ruth instructed, falling back on half-remembered nursing skills from her mother's illness. "I'll heat water." Between them, they stripped the child of his frozen clothing and wrapped him in warm blankets before the fire. Stone held the boy close to his chest, sharing body heat, while Ruth prepared a hot drink sweetened with honey. "Come on, little one," Stone murmured, his voice gentler than Ruth had ever heard it. "Stay with us." And slowly the boy's shivering subsided. Color returned to his pale face. His eyes, a startling blue against his dirt-smudged features, fluttered open, darting fearfully between Stone and Ruth. "You're safe," Ruth assured him, kneeling beside them. "The storm can't get you in here." The child didn't speak, his gaze fixed on the cup in Ruth's hands, and she realized he was likely as hungry as he was cold. "Can you sit up to drink this?" she asked. He nodded, struggling to push himself upright in Stone's arms. The bounty hunter helped him, supporting his back as Ruth held the cup to his lips. The boy drank greedily, his small hands coming up to clutch the cup. "What's your name?" Stone asked when the child had finished drinking. The boy looked at him, then at Ruth, then back to the fire. He didn't answer. "Where are your folks?" Stone tried again. Still no response. "He might be in shock," Ruth suggested quietly. "Or scared." Stone nodded, his expression troubled. "He needs rest. And food when he's warmer." They settled the boy on a pallet before the fire, piling blankets around his small form. Within minutes, exhaustion claimed him, his breathing deepening into sleep. Stone and Ruth moved away to speak without disturbing him. "Where could he have come from?" Ruth whispered. "There's nothing for miles." "Someone could have left him," Stone replied, his voice hard. "Or he could have wandered off from a wagon train, though this is the wrong season for it." Ruth glanced at the sleeping child, noting details she'd missed in the initial urgency, the quality of his clothes beneath the dirt, and where the fine bones of his face, a small scar shaped like a crescent moon on his ankle. "He's not from around here," she observed. "Those clothes weren't made for frontier life." Stone's gaze followed hers, lingering on the boy's face. Something flickered in his expression, a shadow of recognition quickly suppressed. "We'll ask him in the morning," he decided. "For now, he needs sleep, and so do you." Ruth hesitated. "I can stay with him, in case he wakes frightened." "I'll stay," Stone countered. "You take your rest." But Ruth shook her head. "We both stay, then. I don't think either of us will sleep much anyway." They settled on opposite sides of the hearth, the sleeping boy between them. The storm continued to rage outside, but within the cabin, a strange peace had descended, a shared vigil over an unexpected guest. Ruth watched Stone across the fire's glow. His eyes never left the child's face, his expression a complex mixture of wonder, worry, and something deeper that Ruth couldn't name. It struck her that this man, feared by so many, hardened by war and loss, had not hesitated for a moment to take in a strange child from the storm. As dawn approached, the boy stirred, whimpering in his sleep. Without conscious thought, Ruth began to hum softly a lullaby her mother had sung to her, the melody simple and soothing. Stone looked up, startled by the sound. Their eyes met across the sleeping child, And in that moment, a current of understanding passed between them. Whatever had brought this boy to their door on this stormy night, they were now united in protecting him. Outside, the blizzard gradually subsided, giving way to the pale light of a snow-shrouded morning. Inside, three souls damaged in different ways, brought together by circumstance, formed the beginning of something none of them could yet name. Morning light filtered through frost-covered windows, casting prismatic patterns across the cabin floor. The boy slept on his small chest, rising and falling beneath layers of blankets. Ruth had dozed off in her chair sometime before dawn, her head tilted at an uncomfortable angle. Only Stone remained awake, his gray eyes never leaving the child's face. When Ruth finally stirred, she found Stone in the same position she'd last seen him, vigilant, still a sentry against unknown threats. The fire had burned low, yet the cabin remained warm. "Has he woken?" she whispered, straightening with a wince as her stiff muscles protested. Stone shook his head, stirred a few times, nothing more. Ruth studied the sleeping child in the clear light of morning. He was young, perhaps 7, though small for his age, with a mop of dark hair that fell across his forehead. His face, cleaned of dirt, revealed delicate features that seemed at odds with the calluses on his small hands. "He's been working," Stone observed, following her gaze. "Not just wandering." Ruth nodded. "But those clothes weren't made for labor. Look at the stitching on his shirt. That's fine work, even worn as it is." Something unreadable flickered in Stone's eyes. "Someone's looking for him." "Or abandoned him," Ruth countered softly. The boy's eyelids fluttered, then opened. Startlingly blue eyes, the color of summer skies, darted between Ruth and Stone, widening with alarm. He scrambled backward until his spine pressed against the hearth, his thin arms wrapping protectively around his knees. "You're safe," Ruth said gently, keeping her distance. "We found you in the storm last night. Do you remember?" The child stared at her, unblinking. No recognition, no response. Stone rose slowly, his height surely intimidating to the frightened boy. "You must be hungry," he said, his gruff voice softened. "I'll make breakfast." As Stone moved to the stove, Ruth stayed where she was, giving the child space. "I'm Ruth," she offered. "That's Mr. Stone. This is his home, but you're welcome here as long as you need." Still no verbal response, though the boy's gaze tracked Stone's movements with wary interest. "Can you tell us your name?" Ruth tried again. The boy's lips parted, but no sound emerged. One small hand rose to his throat, touching it with a gesture that spoke volumes. "You can't speak," Ruth realized aloud. It wasn't a question. The child gave a single, solemn nod. Stone glanced over his shoulder, a frown creasing his brow. "Born that way or hurt?" The boy hesitated, then held up 2 fingers. "Hurt," Stone translated, his voice hardening. "Recently." Another nod. Ruth's heart constricted. Who would harm a child's voice? What kind of cruelty could silence someone so young? "Are you running from someone?" Stone asked bluntly. The boy's eyes filled with tears, but he nodded again, the movement barely perceptible. Stone and Ruth exchanged a look laden with shared understanding. Whoever this child was fleeing, they would not turn him away. "You're safe here," Stone said with quiet authority. "No one will find you unless you want to be found." The tension in the boy's thin shoulders eased slightly. Stone returned to cooking, while Ruth cautiously approached, sitting on the floor a respectful distance from the child. "Are you from around here?" she asked, a shake of the head. Far away, a nod. "Do you have a way to tell us your name?" The boy considered this, then mimed writing on his palm. "Of course." Ruth retrieved a small slate and chalk from her teaching supplies. "Here." With painstaking care, the child wrote in surprisingly neat letters, "Isaiah." "Isaiah," Ruth read aloud. "That's a fine name." Stone set 3 bowls of porridge on the table, each drizzled with honey and sprinkled with dried berries. "Food's ready," he announced. "Isaiah, you are welcome at this table, Sissy." The boy Isaiah rose hesitantly, still clutching the slate. He approached the table with the caution of someone accustomed to having things snatched away at the last moment. "No one will take it from you," Ruth assured him, recognizing the fear. "There's plenty." They ate in silence, Isaiah consuming his portion with the controlled desperation of the truly hungry, not wolfing it down but eating steadily, methodically, as if uncertain when his next meal might come. When he finished, he wrote on the slate again, "Thank you." "You're welcome," Stone replied with grave courtesy. "There's more if you want it." Isaiah shook his head, then wrote, "Where am I?" Our cabin, Ruth answered, about 5 miles from a town called Redemption Creek in Montana Territory. The boy's eyes widened and he scribbled frantically. How far from Helena? Stone's expression sharpened with interest. Helena's about 60 miles northeast. Is that where you're from? Isaiah hesitated, then wrote, near there. Bad man. Someone in Helena hurt you. Stone pressed his voice carefully neutral. The boy nodded, his small face solemn. Well, Ruth said firmly, you're far from there now, and you can stay with us until we figure out what's best. Isaiah studied her face, then Stone's, as if searching for deception. Whatever he saw must have reassured him, for he wrote, Can I help? Ruth smiled. Of course, we all contribute here. And so Isaiah joined their household, a silent presence that somehow filled the cabin with new energy. He followed Stone outside to learn about chopping kindling. Though Stone wouldn't let him handle the axe, helped Ruth prepare vegetables for stew, and proved remarkably adept at determining which logs would burn cleanest in the fireplace. That night, Ruth made a pallet for him near the hearth, but the arrangement clearly troubled Stone. He should have the bedroom, he insisted quietly while Isaiah was washing up. And where would I sleep? Ruth asked. You could share. It's proper enough with a child. Ruth considered this. Let's ask him what he prefers. Isaiah, given the choice, pointed firmly to the hearth. When pressed, he wrote safer. Can see door. The simple statement revealed volumes about the boy's recent experiences. What had happened to make a child so conscious of escape routes? Who had he been watching for? Later, after Isaiah had fallen asleep, Ruth and Stone spoke in hushed tones at the table. We should go to town tomorrow, Stone said. See if there's word of a missing and he needs clothes, proper boots. Ruth nodded. He needs a doctor, too. That throat injury? Doc Jenkins is discreet, Stone cut in. Won't ask questions if I tell him not to. And if someone is looking for him, someone from Helena, Stone's expression hardened. Then we'll learn who and why. There was something in his voice, a steel edge that reminded Ruth of the rumors about his past. Jedediah Stone might have shown her nothing but gentleness, but she didn't doubt for a moment that he could be dangerous when provoked. We should teach him to write more efficiently, she suggested, changing the subject. If he can't speak, he'll need better ways to communicate. Agreed. Stone's gaze drifted to the sleeping child. He's bright, picks things up quickly. Ruth studied Stone's profile in the firelight. The stern lines of his face had softened as he watched Isaiah, the habitual guardedness, giving way to something more vulnerable. She recognized it with a pang, the look of someone seeing a second chance they'd never expected. You're good with him, she observed quietly. Stone's shoulders stiffened slightly. Had practiced once. The simple admission hung in the air between them, an acknowledgement of his lost son that felt like a door cracking open. Ruth reached across the table, her fingers stopping just short of his hand. We'll help him, she said. Together. Stone met her gaze, something shifting in his gray eyes. After a moment, he nodded once, a silent pact sealed. The journey to Redemption Creek the next day was slow going. The storm had left snowdrifts deep enough to reach a horse's chest, in places forcing them to find alternate paths through the woods. Isaiah rode with Ruth, his small body tucked against hers for warmth. The town appeared unchanged since Ruth had last seen it, the same weathered buildings lining the main street, the same chimney smoke spiraling into the crisp air. Yet she viewed it differently now through the lens of her newfound situation. No longer a captive awaiting sale, but a woman making choices of her own. They stopped first at the general store, where the proprietor, a thin man with spectacles perched on a beaked nose, greeted Stone with cautious respect. Mr. Stone, unexpected to see you so soon after the last supply run. Need children's clothes, Stone replied without preamble. Boots too, warm ones. The shopkeeper's gaze traveled to Isaiah, who pressed closer to Ruth's side. I see. Well, I have some things might fit the boy. Mrs. Thornton brought in her son's outgrown things last month. Good quality. As the man gathered items for their inspection, the bell above the door jingled. Mayor Harmon entered, stamping snow from his boots. He froze momentarily at the sight of them, his pale blue eyes widening with surprise. Miss Adams, he said, recovering quickly, you're looking well. Ruth inclined her head, aware of the undercurrents between the two men. Mayor Harmon. The older man's attention shifted to Isaiah, who had partially hidden himself behind Ruth's skirts. And who's this young fellow? Before Ruth could respond, Stone stepped between them, found him in the storm, taking him to Doc Jenkins after this. Harmon's bushy eyebrows rose. Astray, is he? Well, this town was built on second chances. His gaze returned to Ruth, something like regret flickering in his eyes. Some deserved more than they got. An uncomfortable silence fell, broken only when the shopkeeper returned with an armload of clothing. Ruth busied herself with examining the items, selecting what would fit Isaiah's slight frame. Harmon moved closer to Stone, speaking in a low voice that Ruth nevertheless overheard. There's talk from Helena, bounty hunter, asking after you in the saloon yesterday. Stone's expression didn't change, but Ruth saw his hand tighten on the counter edge. Named Webster. Said he'd be back today or tomorrow, depending on the trails. What's he want? Harmon shrugged. Didn't say. Just asked if you still kept a cabin outside town. Stone nodded once, a sharp jerk of his head. Appreciate the warning. Wasn't for you, Harmon replied, his voice dropping further. Was for them. He gestured subtly toward Ruth and Isaiah. Something passed between the men, an understanding Ruth couldn't fully decipher. Then Harmon touched the brim of his hat and departed, leaving a tension in his wake that Ruth could almost taste. They completed their purchases in silence, adding food supplies and medicine to the pile of children's clothing. Isaiah remained close to Ruth, his blue eyes darting nervously around the store as if expecting danger from any quarter. What was that about? Ruth asked quietly as they left packages secured in Stone's saddlebags. Nothing good, he replied grimly. We'll see Jenkins, then head back. Best not to linger. The doctor's office was a small building attached to his home at the edge of town. Jenkins himself was a surprisingly young man with prematurely gray hair and kind eyes that crinkled at the corners when he smiled. Stone, he greeted warmly. Twice in a year must be my lucky day. Stone's mouth twitched in what might have been the ghost of a smile. Need your help, Doc, and your discretion. Jenkins nodded, his expression turning serious. Always have both. Come in. Inside the doctor's examining room was meticulously clean instruments gleaming in glass-fronted cabinets. Isaiah balked at the threshold, his face paling at the sight. It's all right, Ruth soothed, kneeling to meet his eyes. Jenkins just wants to make sure you're healthy. I'll stay with you the whole time. Still hesitant, Isaiah allowed himself to be led to the examining table. As Stone explained the situation, finding the boy in the storm, his inability to speak the suggestion of recent trauma, Jenkins listened without interruption, his kind face grave. The examination was gentle but thorough. Jenkins spoke directly to Isaiah throughout, explaining what he was doing before each step. When he finally examined the boy's throat, his expression darkened. Someone did this deliberately, he said, his voice tight with controlled anger. Press something here, a thumb may be hard enough to damage the vocal cords. Ruth felt ill. Will he speak again? Jenkins sighed. Hard to say. The physical damage might heal with time. But he glanced at Isaiah, then at Stone, clearly weighing his words. Sometimes the mind protects itself by maintaining silence even after the body heals. He writes, Stone offered. Communicates well enough as that way. That's good. Keep encouraging it. Jenkins rummaged in a cabinet, producing a jar of salve and a small bottle of tonic. This for his throat, apply morning and night, and this to build his strength. He's underweight, though not dangerously so. As Jenkins made notes in his ledger, Isaiah slipped from the table and wandered to the window, peering out at the street with evident anxiety. One more thing, Stone said, lowering his voice. You hear anything about a missing boy from Helena or thereabouts? The doctor frowned. Nothing specific, though there was a notice about a runaway from the mining company orphanage a few weeks back. Boy about this age, taken in after his mother died in a house fire. Ruth glanced at Isaiah, who had gone very still by the window. Do you know the child's name? Thomas, I believe. Thomas something. Never saw the boy myself. Stone's sharp intake of breath was audible in the quiet room. Ruth looked at him with concern, recognizing the significance of the name. Thomas, he repeated, his voice strained. Jenkins nodded. Common enough name. Why does it mean something to you? Before Stone could answer, Isaiah suddenly darted from the window to tug urgently at Ruth's sleeve. His face was pale with fear as he pointed frantically toward the street. Stone was at the window in 2 strides. Damn, he muttered. Webster. Ruth joined him, peering out to see a stranger dismounting before the saloon across the street, a tall man with a shock of red hair and a duster that failed to conceal the guns at his hips. "The bounty hunter Harmon mentioned," she asked. Stone nodded curtly. "We need to leave, now." Jenkins, sensing the urgency, quickly gathered the medicines into a package. "There's a back door through my kitchen," he offered. "Leads to the alley behind." "Much obliged," Stone replied, already shepherding Ruth and Isaiah toward the indicated exit. "Stone," the doctor called after them, "whatever trouble's brewing, be careful. That boy needs stability now more than anything." They slipped out through the kitchen and into the narrow alley behind the row of building swings. Stone led them on a circuitous route that avoided the main street, eventually reaching the livery stable from the rear. "Wait here," he instructed, positioning them in the shadow of a woodpile. "I'll get the horses." Isaiah clung to Ruth's hand, his blue eyes wide with fear. She knelt beside him, brushing snow from his new coat. "It's all right," she soothed. "Mr. Stone won't let anyone hurt you." The boy pulled his slate from his pocket and scrawled hastily, "He wants me. Bad man." "Webster?" Ruth asked, startled. "You know him." Isaiah nodded vigorously, then wrote, "He hurt others, at the home." A chill that had nothing to do with the winter air swept through Ruth. "He won't hurt you anymore," she promised, pulling the child close. "We won't let him." Stone returned minutes later, leading both horses, his expression grim. "Mount up quick," he said. "Webster's asking after us at the general store. Won't be long before he checks here." They rode out the back way, avoiding the main road in favor of a game trail that wound through the woods north of town. Stone set a punishing pace, pushing the horses as fast as the snow-laden trail allowed. Only when they were several miles from Redemption Creek did he slow, allowing the winded animals to recover. Ruth's arms ached from holding Isaiah securely before her in the saddle, but the boy hadn't complained once his small body tensed with alertness. He recognized Webster, Ruth told Stone when they drew alongside each other. "Says he hurt children at some home." Stone's expression darkened further. "The orphanage Jenkins mentioned, likely." "But why would a bounty hunter be involved with an orphanage?" "Some operations aren't what they seem," Stone replied cryptically, "especially in mining towns." The implication hung unspoken between them. Child labor, exploitation, practices that continued in remote territories despite laws against them. "We can't go back to the cabin," Stone said after a moment. "First place he'll look." "The Wilsons," Ruth suggested. Stone considered this, then shook his head. "Too obvious a connection. But I know another place. Trapper's cabin about 15 miles north. Used it myself in lean times." Ruth nodded, trusting his judgment. "How long will we need to hide?" "Depends on what Webster wants." Stone's gaze shifted to Isaiah, who was watching their exchange intently. "And who he works for." They rode in tense silence for several hours, the landscape growing wilder and more rugged as they headed north into the mountains. The trail narrowed in places, becoming little more than a deer path winding between towering pines. Isaiah eventually dozed against Ruth, exhaustion overcoming his fear. She held him securely, marveling at how quickly the child had come to trust her. Or perhaps not trust exactly, but recognize her as safer than what he'd fled. By late afternoon, storm clouds were gathering again, the temperature dropping precipitously. Ruth's toes had gone numb in her boots, and Isaiah shivered even in sleep. "Not much further," Stone assured her, noting her discomfort. "See that ridge cabins just beyond." The trapper's shelter proved to be smaller than Stone's home, a single room with a stone fireplace and crude furnishings. It smelled of animal hides and wood smoke, but it was solid and defensible, a good place to wait out both the weather and whatever threat Webster posed. Stone worked quickly to build a fire while Ruth settled Isaiah on the cabin's single cot, covering him with their blankets. The boy didn't wake, his exhaustion complete. "He knows more than he's telling us," Stone observed quietly, nodding toward the sleeping child. Ruth sighed. "He's terrified, Jed, and for good reason if Webster is any indication." It was the first time she'd used his given name in intimacy that slipped out unplanned. Stone glanced at her sharply but didn't comment on the familiarity. "Webster's dangerous," he said instead. "Known him by reputation for years, not a man who gives up easily." "What would he want with a child?" "Could be a contract, someone paying to find the boy." Or, Ruth pressed, sensing there was more. Stone's expression hardened. "Or he's covering tracks, making sure secrets stay buried." The fire caught flames, licking eagerly at the dry pine. Its warmth began to chase the chill from the small cabin, But Ruth felt a different kind of cold taking root inside her, a dread of what Isaiah might have witnessed, what he might know. When you were, she hesitated, unsure how to phrase it delicately. In your former profession, did you ever hunt children? No. Stone's response was immediate and absolute. Never, some lines you don't cross. Ruth studied his face in the firelight, seeing no deception there. But others would, for the right price, yes. He knelt before the hearth, feeding another log to the flames. There are men who specialize in finding runaways, apprentices who've broken contracts, orphans placed with families who decided they weren't suitable, and returning them to what abuse exploitation. Stone's shoulders tensed. I didn't ask questions, not back then. The admission hung between them, not an excuse, but an acknowledgement of complicity through silence. Ruth thought of Isaiah's muteness, how it too was a form of silence imposed by cruelty. And now, she asked softly. Stone looked up, his gray eyes reflecting the firelight. Now I'm asking, and I don't like the answers. They shared a simple meal from their supplies, setting aside a portion for Isaiah when he woke. As night fell, the promised storm arrived, wind shrieking around the cabin's eaves and snow piling against its walls. Ruth sat beside the sleeping boy, gently stroking his dark hair. In repose, his features relaxed. He looked even younger, perhaps closer to 6 than 7. Too young to have endured whatever had driven him to flee into a blizzard rather than remain where he was. I've been thinking, she said quietly to Stone, who sat cleaning his rifle on the other side of the hearth, about what the doctor said about the boy from the orphanage. Stone's hand stilled on the weapon. Thomas. Yes. Ruth chose her words carefully, aware of the raw wound she was probing. You lost a son by that name. It wasn't a question, but Stone answered anyway. Yes. How long ago? 3 years, last October. Ruth looked down at Isaiah, measuring. He would be about this age now, wouldn't he? Stone set the rifle aside, his movements deliberate. What are you suggesting, Ruth? Nothing, she said quickly. Only coincidences sometimes aren't. My son is dead, Stone said flatly. Him and his mother both. Fever took them while I was away. You saw them buried. A muscle in Stone's jaw twitched. I saw the graves, came home to fresh dirt and a town full of condolences. Ruth persisted gently, but not the bodies. They were already in the ground. His voice had roughened. Doctor said the fever was contagious. Burial had to be quick. Which doctor? Stone's gaze snapped to hers, suddenly sharp. What are you getting at? I don't know, Ruth admitted, but Isaiah is running from something terrible. He knows Webster, and he appeared at your door, your isolated cabin miles from anywhere in the middle of a blizzard. Coincidence, Stone insisted. But doubt had crept into his tone. Perhaps, Ruth conceded, but consider this, what if your son didn't die? What if someone took him, someone who had reason to want you to believe he was gone? Stone stood abruptly, pacing the small confines of the cabin. That's not possible. The whole town knew. The preacher said words over the graves, the mayor himself. He stopped short, a new thought visibly striking him. The mayor himself what? Ruth prompted. Harmon, Stone said slowly. He was there. Paid for the coffins himself since I wasn't there to do it. The same Mayor Harmon who warned you about Webster today. Stone's expression transformed, revelation dawning like a cold sun. Harmon knew Emily before I did. They were from the same town back east. Stone's voice faltered. He asked her to marry him once. Before the war. Before me. Ruth felt a chill that had nothing to do with the storm raging outside. And she chose you instead. She did. Stone's gaze returned to the sleeping boy, seeing him with new eyes. It couldn't be. It's not possible. But his voice lacked conviction now, uncertainty bleeding through the cracks in his certainty. Isaiah stirred, perhaps disturbed by their voices or caught in a dream. His small face contorted, a whimper escaping his lips. Ruth soothed him, automatically humming the lullaby her mother had taught her. The simple melody filled the cabin, rising above the storm's howl. Isaiah settled his features, smoothing once more. Stone watched them, his expression raw with a hope he seemed afraid to acknowledge. I should take first watch, he said abruptly, in case Webster tracked us. Ruth nodded, understanding his need for distance, for time to process the possibility she'd raised. Wake me in a few hours. You need rest too. He moved to the cabin's single window, positioning himself where he could see both the approach to the cabin and its interior. His rifle rested across his knees, ready, but not threatening. Ruth continued humming the melody, a comfort to herself as much as to Isaiah. Outside, the storm raged on a white fury that erased trails and buried secrets. Inside, a different storm was brewing, one of hope and fear in equal measure. Ruth woke to pale dawn light filtering through the cabin's single window. She'd fallen asleep beside Isaiah on the cot, her back aching from the awkward position. Stone was still at his post, his profile silhouetted against the gray morning. "You didn't wake me," she accused softly, careful not to disturb the still sleeping child. "Wasn't tired," Stone replied, though the shadows beneath his eyes belied the claim. Ruth rose, stretching cramped muscles. "The storm's passed." "Yes, but the snow's deep. We won't make good time today." "Where are we going?" Stone's gaze shifted to Isaiah. "I've been thinking about what you said, about possibilities." Ruth waited, not pushing. "There's someone who would know," he continued, "the midwife who delivered Thomas. She moved to Helena after I thought they died. If anyone could confirm." "You want to go to Helena?" Ruth couldn't hide her surprise. "But that's where Isaiah ran from, where Webster likely came from. Sometimes you have to walk into the lion's den to find the truth." Stone finally looked away from the window, meeting her gaze directly. "But I won't risk you or the boy. I'll go alone." "No," the word came out sharper than Ruth intended. "We stay together. All of us." Stone's expression softened slightly. "Ruth, he trusts us," she interrupted. "Both of us. And you'll need me if you're asking questions about an orphanage. A woman might learn things a man with a gun wouldn't." They were interrupted by a soft sound from the cot. Isaiah was awake, watching their exchange with solemn blue eyes. "Good morning," Ruth greeted him with forced cheer. "Are you hungry?" The boy nodded, sitting up and reaching automatically for his slate. After a moment's consideration, he wrote, "Where go?" Stone and Ruth exchanged a glance. "We're discussing that," Stone answered carefully. "We might need to travel a bit further. Would you be up for that?" Isaiah hesitated, then wrote, "Away from bad man?" "Yes," Stone assured him. "Far from him." The boy seemed to consider this, then added, "I know place. Safe." Ruth sat beside him on the cot. "What place?" Isaiah. "River House. Lady helps." "Is this in Helena?" Stone asked, moving closer. Isaiah nodded, then elaborated, "Edge of town. Blue door. She hides children." Stone and Ruth exchanged another look, weighted with significance. "Do you know the lady's name?" Ruth asked gently. Isaiah's face screwed up in concentration. After a moment, he carefully wrote, "Mrs. Wilson." The name hit Stone like a physical blow. "Wilson," he repeated. "Martha Wilson." The boy nodded vigorously, excitement brightening his features. "That's impossible," Stone said, his voice hollow. "Martha Wilson lives near my cabin. We visited her just days ago." Isaiah shook his head emphatically, then wrote, "Helena, Blue House, River." "Isaiah," Ruth said carefully, "the Mrs. Wilson we know is an older lady with white hair. Her husband has a bad leg. They live on a farm not by a river." The boy considered this, then wrote, "Different Wilson." "Maybe," Stone conceded, though he looked troubled. "Helena's a big enough place. Could be coincidence." But Ruth was remembering something, Martha Wilson's words when they'd visited. "I haven't had music in this house since our daughter visited last spring." A daughter who might have married, taken a husband's name, yet still be a Wilson to a child who knew her. "We should ask the Wilsons," she suggested, "before we go anywhere else. They might know something." Stone's expression was guarded. "If they do and they haven't told me in 5 years of acquaintance." He didn't finish the thought, but Ruth understood. Such a deception would be a betrayal beyond forgiveness. They ate a quick breakfast, then prepared to depart. The snow had indeed drifted deep around the cabin, but the sky was clear, promising a cold but fair day for travel. As Stone saddled the horses, Ruth helped Isaiah with his new boots and coat. The boy seemed more animated this morning, his movements quicker, his eyes brighter. Whatever fears had haunted him yesterday appeared somewhat abated by a night of safe rest. "Isaiah," Ruth said softly, kneeling to button his coat. "The bad man Webster, he's looking for you because you ran away from the orphanage, isn't he?" The boy nodded solemnly. "And at this orphanage, did they call you Isaiah or something else?" A shadow crossed his face. He reached for his slate and wrote slowly, "They call me boy," or number 8. Ruth's heart contracted painfully. But before the orphanage, when you were with your mother. Isaiah stared at her, something like longing in his expression. After a long moment, he wrote, "Don't remember. Long time." "And your father," Ruth pressed gently. "Do you remember him?" The boy's face clouded. He shook his head, then added, "Mother said he died in war." Ruth glanced toward the door where Stone was visible through the window securing their packs to the saddles. "Isaiah, this is very important," she said, keeping her voice low. "Have you ever seen Mr. Stone before the night you came to our cabin?" Isaiah's brow furrowed in concentration. He studied Ruth's face, then looked toward Stone. Finally, he wrote, "In dreams, maybe." It wasn't the confirmation she'd hoped for, but neither was it a denial. Memory was a fragile thing, especially in children. 3 years was an eternity at his age. "It's all right," she assured him, smoothing his dark hair. "We'll figure everything out together." They set out as the sun climbed higher, Stone leading them on a roundabout path that avoided the main trails. He was taking no chances with Webster, possibly tracking them, a caution Ruth appreciated. The day was blindingly bright sunlight, reflecting off the new-fallen snow with dazzling intensity. Isaiah rode with Stone this time, his small form nearly swallowed by the bounty hunter's heavy coat which Stone had wrapped around him for extra warmth. They traveled in watchful silence, alert for any sign of pursuit. By midday, the wilderness had given way to more familiar territory. They were approaching the region near Stone's cabin in the Wilson homestead. Stone called a halt on a ridge overlooking the valley where both dwellings lay. From this vantage, Ruth could see Stone's cabin looking smaller and more vulnerable than she remembered. Smoke rose from its chimney, a detail that caused Stone to tense visibly. "Someone's there," he said, voice tight. "Stay with the boy." Before Ruth could protest, he had dismounted and moved into the cover of the trees, rifle in hand. She watched anxiously as he disappeared from view, heading toward his cabin by a circuitous route that used the terrain for concealment. Isaiah tugged at her sleeve, his expression questioning. "It's all right," Ruth assured him, hoping she spoke truth. "Mr. Stone is just checking something." The minutes stretched endlessly. Ruth found herself counting her heartbeats, trying to estimate how long it would take Stone to reach the cabin to assess whatever danger might await there. Just as her anxiety threatened to overwhelm her patience, Stone reappeared, moving swiftly up the ridge toward them. His expression was grim. "Webster?" Ruth asked as he reached them. Stone shook his head. "Mayor Harmon and Theodore Wilson." Ruth blinked in surprise. "The Wilson, or why would they?" "Don't know, but I don't like coincidences." Stone remounted his horse. "We're going to circle around, approach the Wilson place from the north. Stay out of sight until I can figure out what's happening." They rode in tense silence, taking a game trail that wound through dense forest before emerging on the far side of the Wilson homestead. Stone led them to a small copse of trees that offered a clear view of the farmhouse while providing cover. "Stay here," he instructed, dismounting. "I'm going to get closer, see if I can hear what they're saying." "Be careful," Ruth urged, noting the set of his jaw. Whatever trust Stone had placed in the Wilsons was clearly strained to breaking. Isaiah watched Stone go with evident anxiety, his small hand clutching Ruth's skirt. She put an arm around his shoulders, offering what comfort she could. "It's going to be all right," she murmured, wishing she felt as confident as she tried to sound. Stone moved like a shadow through the trees, his years as a scout and hunter evident in his silent approach. Ruth lost sight of him as he neared the farmhouse, the angle obscuring her view. Long minutes passed. Isaiah grew restless, shifting from foot to foot in the cold. Ruth was about to suggest they move to a more sheltered position when a sound froze her in place, the distant thunder of approaching horses moving fast. From their vantage, she could see riders emerging from the tree line to the east. 3 men, one with the unmistakable shock of red hair, visible even at this distance. "Webster." "We need to go," Ruth whispered urgently, pulling Isaiah toward their horses. "Now." But before they could mount, a shot rang out from the direction of the farmhouse, a single sharp crack that echoed across the snow-covered landscape. Birds erupted from the trees, their startled cries adding to the chaos. Isaiah's face went white with fear. Ruth lifted him quickly onto her horse, then swung up behind him. "Hold tight," she instructed, wheeling the animal around. A shout rose from the direction of the Wilson Place Stone's voice, though Ruth couldn't make out the words. More gunshots followed the rapid exchange, suggesting a full-fledged firefight. Ruth hesitated, torn between fleeing with Isaiah and going to Stone's aid. The boy solved her dilemma by pointing urgently away from the battle, his meaning clear. Run. With a silent prayer for Stone's safety, Ruth dug her heels into the horse's flanks, spurring it into motion. They plunged into the forest, heading away from both the Wilson homestead and Stone's cabin, seeking the deepest cover they could find. Behind them, the gunfire continued, punctuated by shouts and the neighing of frightened horses. Ruth rode blindly, focused only on putting distance between Isaiah and the danger at their backs. They had gone perhaps a mile when a figure on horseback burst from the trees directly in their path. Ruth reined in sharply, nearly unseating herself and Isaiah. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she recognized the rider. Mayor Horace Harmon sat atop a lathered horse, his silver hair wild, a pistol gripped in his right hand. Blood stained his left sleeve, evidence that he'd been wounded in the firefight. "Miss Adams," he panted, lowering the gun slightly. "Thank God." "Mayor Harmon," Ruth acknowledged, keeping her voice steady despite her racing pulse. "What's happening back there?" "Where's Stone?" Harmon's weathered face was grave. "Fighting for his life, I expect. Webster brought men. They've got the Wilsons pinned down in the house." "And you left?" Ruth couldn't keep the accusation from her voice. "To find you," Harmon retorted. "And the boy?" His pale blue eyes fixed on Isaiah, who shrank against Ruth. "You need to come with me. Both of you. I know somewhere safe." Ruth's instincts flared with warning. "We're not going anywhere without Stone." Harmon's expression hardened. "Stone can take care of himself, always has. But that boy," he gestured toward Isaiah with his chin, "he's in danger every second he's out here. From Webster. From Webster. From others. There are powerful people looking for him, Miss Adams. People who want what he knows buried forever." Ruth tightened her arm around Isaiah. "And what does he know at Bagley?" Harmon glanced over his shoulder, clearly anxious about pursuit. "No time to explain now, but I swear on my life I'm trying to help you. Both of you." "Why should I believe you?" The mayor's gaze returned to her, something like respect kindling in his eyes. "Because I've been watching over this boy since his mother died. Because I owe her that much at least." "His mother," Ruth repeated. "You knew her." "Better than most," Harmon replied grimly. "Now please, we need to move. Webster's men will be looking for us once they realize I've slipped away." Ruth hesitated, torn between her instinctive distrust and the urgent need to get Isaiah to safety. The boy himself provided the answer, tugging at her sleeve and pointing at Harmon with a nod. He trusted the mayor, or at least preferred him to the approaching danger. "What about Stone?" Ruth asked, still reluctant. "If he survives, he'll find us," Harmon assured her. "He's the best tracker in 3 territories. But right now, the boy is what matters." With a silent prayer that she wasn't making a terrible mistake, Ruth nudged her horse forward. "Lead the way," she told Harmon. "But know that if you betray us, Stone will hunt you to the ends of the earth." A grim smile touched the mayor's lips. "Of that, Miss Adams, I have no doubt." Together they rode deeper into the wilderness, leaving behind the sounds of conflict. Ruth's heart was divided, part of it remaining with Stone facing unknown enemies at the Wilson farm, part of it pressing forward with Isaiah, whose small body trembled against hers, with each hoofbeat carrying them further into uncertainty. Whatever truth lay at the heart of this tangled web, Ruth knew one thing with absolute certainty: nothing would ever be the same again. The abandoned church stood sentinel at the edge of Redemption Creek, its weathered spire pointing accusingly toward heaven. Once white-clappered, had faded to the color of old bones, windows boarded against winter's assault. Only the small blue door at the rear, freshly painted, incongruously bright, suggested human presence. Mayor Harmon dismounted stiffly, his wounded arm held close to his body. Blood had soaked through his sleeve, freezing in the bitter cold. "In here," he instructed, gesturing toward the blue door. "Quickly now." Ruth helped Isaiah down before dismounting herself, her limbs stiff from the hard ride. They'd traveled for hours along game trails and forgotten logging roads, doubling back several times to ensure they weren't followed. "The church," she questioned, eyeing the dilapidated building skeptically. "Safer than it looks," Harmon assured her, producing a key from his waistcoat pocket. "And the last place Webster would think to search." The blue door opened with a protesting creak revealing darkness beyond. Harmon entered first, striking a match to light a lantern that hung just inside. Golden light spilled forth, illuminating what had once been the church's small vestry, now converted into a simple living space. A narrow bed occupied one corner. A pot-bellied stove stood cold in another. Shelves lined the walls, stocked with provisions, and Ruth noted with surprise children's books and toys. "You've prepared this place," she observed, helping Isaiah inside and closing the door against the gathering dusk. Harmon nodded, wincing as he shrugged off his blood-stained coat. "Been maintaining it for almost 3 years now. Way station of sorts for those who need it." "Children, you mean?" Ruth watched as Isaiah explored the small space, his expression lighting with recognition as he discovered a wooden toy soldier tucked among the books. "Some children, yes." Harmon sank onto a chair, exhaustion evident in every line of his body. "Others, too. Anyone needing shelter from storms, human or otherwise." Ruth built a fire in the stove while Harmon cleaned and bandaged his wound, a bullet graze that looked painful but not life-threatening. Isaiah remained quiet, watching them both with the wary attention of a child accustomed to assessing adult moods for signs of danger. "You owe us an explanation," Ruth had said finally when warmth had begun to chase the chill from the vestry. "About Isaiah, about Webster, about whatever connection exists between them and Stone." Harmon's weathered face seemed to age further in the lantern light. "It's a long story, Miss Adams, and not a pretty one." "We have time," she replied firmly, "and I've seen ugliness before." The mayor studied her for a long moment, then nodded, acknowledging the steel beneath her gentle exterior. "Very well, but first I should tend to the boy. He must be hungry." Isaiah had indeed been watching their food preparations with barely disguised longing. Ruth prepared a simple meal from the provisions stored in the vestry: beans warmed on the stove, dried apples soaked to softness, hard biscuits that became palatable when dipped in hot tea. They ate in silence, the only sounds the wind's mournful keening through the abandoned church beyond the vestry door, and the occasional pop from the stove. Isaiah finished first, his small face relaxing as his hunger was satisfied. Harmon watched the boy with an expression Ruth couldn't quite decipher, something between guilt and tenderness, perhaps. When Isaiah yawned and the mayor pointed to the narrow bed, "Rest, son," he said gently. "You're safe here." To Ruth's surprise, Isaiah went without protest, curling beneath the blankets with the wooden soldier clutched in one hand. Within minutes, his breathing had deepened into sleep. "He trusts you," Ruth observed quietly. "Not me," Harmon corrected. "This place. He's been here before. Last summer, and before that, the winter after his mother died." Harmon poured himself more tea, adding a splash from a flask he produced from his vest pocket. He offered the flask to Ruth, who declined with a shake of her head. "His mother?" Ruth prompted. "You said you knew her." "Yes." Harmon's gaze drifted to the sleeping child. "I knew Emily Stone since she was no higher than my knee. Her father and I fought in the Mexican War together. When he died, I looked after his family best I could." Ruth's breath caught. "Emily Stone, Jedediah's wife." Harmon nodded, his expression somber. "She was like a niece to me. Or a daughter, perhaps. I'd have done anything for her, including lie about her death." Ruth's voice sharpened with accusation. The mayor's pale blue eyes met hers directly. "Including that, yes, when the situation warranted it." What situation could possibly warrant telling a man his wife and child were dead when they weren't? Harmon took a long swallow of his doctored tea before answering. One where the alternative was their actual death at the hands of men worse than Webster. Ruth sat back, momentarily silenced by the gravity in his tone. Outside, the wind rose to a howl, rattling the boarded windows like restless spirits seeking entry. "I need you to understand something, Miss Adams," Harmon continued. "Jedediah Stone wasn't always the man you know now. After the war, he was changed. We all were those of us who survived. But Stone took to hunting men for money, became known for bringing back bounties that others couldn't find." "I've heard the stories," Ruth acknowledged. "Not all of them, I'll wager." Harmon's gaze hardened. 3 years ago, Stone took a contract that put him on the wrong side of some powerful men. Mining interests. The kind that don't blink at burying their problems permanently. What kind of contract? Finding witnesses. Men who could testify about unsafe conditions in the Helena mines. Conditions that led to a collapse that killed 27 miners. Harmon's voice grew quieter. One of those witnesses was Emily's brother, Jacob. He survived the collapse but was being hunted by the company's men to ensure his silence. Ruth leaned forward, piecing together the narrative. So Stone was helping him? In his way, yes, but by doing so, he painted targets on all their backs, his own Jacob's, even Emily's, and Thomas's. Harmon's gaze returned to the sleeping child. The mining company sent men to Stone's home while he was away tracking Jacob. Men like Webster. A chill that had nothing to do with the winter night crept down Ruth's spine. They were going to kill Emily and Thomas. Harmon nodded grimly. Would have if I hadn't arrived first. I'd gotten wind of their plan from a telegrapher who owed me a favor. Got Emily and the boy out just hours before Webster arrived. And then you told everyone they'd died of fever. Ruth concluded, an understanding dawning, to protect them. It was the only way, Harmon confirmed. As long as everyone, including Stone, believed they were dead, the mining company would have no reason to keep hunting them. Ruth frowned, trying to reconcile this account with what she knew. But if you were protecting them, why was Isaiah in an orphanage? Why was he running from Webster now? Pain flickered across Harmon's weathered features. Because I failed them, he admitted heavily. I arranged safe passage for Emily and Thomas to San Francisco. New names, new start. But Emily, she couldn't bear leaving without saying goodbye to her brother. Jacob, Ruth supplied. Yes, I tried to dissuade her, but she was stubborn, insisted on meeting him in Helena before departing. Harmon's voice roughened with remembered anguish. Webster found them there, killed Jacob outright, set fire to the house where they were meeting. Ruth's hand flew to her mouth. And Emily, Harmon nodded, his eyes bright with unshed tears. She got Thomas out through a window but couldn't follow. The boy saw it all, hasn't spoken a word since. Ruth looked at the sleeping child with new understanding. The trauma of watching his mother die, of being suddenly alone in the world, it was enough to silence anyone, let alone a child so young. How did he end up in the orphanage? I couldn't find him immediately after the fire, Harmon explained. By the time I traced him to Helena, he'd been placed in the mining company's charitable institution, an orphanage in name only. In reality, it's little more than a labor camp preparing boys to work the mines as soon as they're old enough. Dear God, Ruth whispered, horrified. I've been trying to get him out for months, Harmon continued. Establish this place as one stop on a route that helps children escape such situations. But Webster recognized Thomas from the fire, knew he was a witness to Jacob's murder. The boy became a loose end that needed tying off. Ruth's mind reeled with the implications. But how did Isaiah Thomas find his way to Stone's cabin, in a blizzard no less? A hint of a smile touched Harmon's lips. The boy's smarter than most grown men I know. He slipped away from the orphanage during a supply delivery. One of my associates was supposed to meet him at the edge of town, but Webster was already searching. Thomas ran, making his way cross-country, using skills his father taught him before, Harmon faltered, before everything fell apart. He was trying to reach you, Ruth realized, here at the church with the blue door. Yes, but the storm drove him off course. Divine providence, perhaps, that he found his father's cabin instead. Harmon's expression grew solemn, or a son's instinct to find his way home. Ruth sat in stunned silence, absorbing the revelations. If Harmon was telling the truth, and his evident emotion suggested he was, then Isaiah truly was Thomas Stone, the son Jedediah had believed dead for 3 years. Why didn't you tell Stone the truth, she asked finally, after Emily truly died? Surely then... By then the story was too tangled, Harmon interrupted. Stone had become a marked man himself. The mining company put a bounty on him after he helped several more witnesses escape. If he'd suddenly started searching for a boy everyone thought was dead, it would have raised questions. Dangerous ones. So you've been protecting Thomas all this time, alone. Not entirely alone, the Wilsons have helped. Martha was Emily's midwife when Thomas was born. She and Theodore have been part of our efforts to help children escape situations like the Helena orphanage. Ruth thought of the kindly elderly couple, their welcoming farmhouse. That's why they were at Stone's cabin today. Harmon nodded. Theodore was warning Stone about Webster. I arrived to tell them both that Thomas had been found, that he was with you. And then Webster arrived, Ruth concluded grimly. Yes, he's been tracking the boy since he escaped. Must have followed our trail from town. Harmon's expression darkened. Stone held them off while I slipped away to find you and Thomas. Theodore and Martha were still in the cabin when I left. Ruth closed her eyes briefly, a prayer rising unbidden for the elderly couple and for Stone himself. Will Stone survive? She asked softly. Against Webster and his men. If anyone could, it's him, Harmon replied, but doubt shadowed his voice. Stone's not an easy man to kill, but he was outnumbered last I saw. The implication hung heavy in the small vestry. Ruth glanced at the sleeping child, Thomas, not Isaiah, and felt a wave of protective fierceness wash over her. Whatever happened, she would ensure this boy wasn't orphaned a second time. What now? She asked Harmon. We can't stay here indefinitely. No, the mayor agreed. Webster knows about this place. It's only a matter of time before he searches here. He rose stiffly, moving to a small desk in the corner. From a drawer, he withdrew a folded map and a sealed envelope. There's a train leaving from Fort Harrison tomorrow morning. Military transport, but they'll take civilians with the right authorization. He handed Ruth the envelope. This should get you and the boy aboard. The map shows how to reach the fort. It's about 15 miles west of here. Ruth stared at the items in her hands. You want us to leave, just flee? It's the safest option, Harmon insisted. The train goes to Cheyenne, then connects to the Transcontinental Railroad. You could be in San Francisco within a week. Start fresh, like Emily intended. Without Stone, Ruth said flatly. Harmon's expression softened with sympathy. Miss Adams, I understand you've formed an attachment to Stone, but you must consider what's best for the boy. His father is best for him, Ruth retorted. They've been separated for 3 years based on your decisions, Mayor. I won't extend that separation by my own choice. Before Harmon could respond, a noise from outside froze them both, the distant but unmistakable sound of horses approaching. Webster, Harmon hissed, extinguishing the lantern with a quick twist. Wake the boy, quietly. Ruth moved to the bed, gently shaking Thomas awake. The child's eyes flew open, instant alertness replacing sleep, the response of someone accustomed to danger. We need to go, she whispered, helping him into his coat. Quietly now. Harmon had opened a trap door, hidden beneath a worn rug, revealing stone steps descending into darkness. Old storage cellar, he explained, lighting a small candle. Connects to tunnels the church elders dug during the war. Leads all the way to the creek. The approaching riders were closer now, voices carrying on the night air. Ruth recognized Webster's distinctive drawl, ordering his men to surround the building. Go, Harmon urged, pressing the map and envelope into Ruth's hands. Follow the tunnel to the creek, then head west. You should reach Fort Harrison by dawn if you push hard. What about you? Ruth asked, even as she guided Thomas toward the trapdoor. Harmon produced a revolver from beneath his coat. I'll buy you time. They'll kill you, Ruth protested. Perhaps. The mayor's smile was grim. But an old man can still make a stand worth remembering. He looked past her to Thomas, his expression softening. You go on now, son. Your father would be proud of how brave you've been. Thomas hesitated, then darted forward to embrace Harmon briefly before returning to Ruth's side. The gesture seemed to strengthen the mayor's resolve. Go, he repeated. Don't stop until you reach the fort. Ruth wanted to argue further, but the riders had reached the church. Hooves clattered on frozen ground, men's voices calling to one another as they established a perimeter. With a last grateful nod to Harmon, Ruth descended the stone steps, helping Thomas navigate the narrow passage. The trapdoor closed above them, sealing them in musty darkness, broken only by the candle's wavering flame. The tunnel was low-ceilinged and damp, forcing Ruth to stoop as they hurried forward. Thomas moved with surprising confidence, as if he'd traveled this path before. Perhaps he had during his previous stays at the church. They had gone perhaps 50 yards when gunfire erupted above them. Sharp reports that penetrated even the earth and stone, separating them from the surface. Thomas flinched, but didn't stop pulling Ruth forward with unexpected strength. The tunnel gradually widened, the air growing fresher as they approached what must be the exit. Ruth extinguished the candle as dim moonlight became visible ahead, a circular opening partially concealed by brambles and deadfall. They emerged on the bank of Redemption Creek, the water a black ribbon winding through ice-crusted snow. The church was no longer visible, hidden behind a rise of land, but the sporadic gunfire continued, a grim reminder that Harmon was still fighting, still buying them time. This way, Ruth whispered, consulting the map by moonlight. Fort Harrison lay west following the creek for several miles before turning north across open country. They moved as quickly as the difficult terrain allowed, keeping to the shelter of trees that lined the watercourse. Thomas proved surprisingly sure-footed in the darkness, often leading Ruth around treacherous patches of ice or hidden depressions in the snow. The gunfire behind them gradually faded, then ceased altogether. Ruth tried not to think about what that silence might mean for Mayor Harmon. Instead, she focused on placing one foot before the other, on keeping Thomas safe, on the hope that somehow Stone had survived his own encounter with Webster's men. They had traveled perhaps 2 miles when Thomas suddenly froze his hand, tightening on Ruth's with painful intensity. He gestured frantically toward the trees ahead, where a shadow detached itself from deeper darkness. Ruth pushed Thomas behind her, reaching for the small knife Stone had insisted she carry. Not much protection against a gun, but better than nothing. "That won't be necessary, Miss Adams." The voice sent relief flooding through her veins, weakening her knees. Jedediah Stone stepped into a patch of moonlight, his tall figure instantly recognizable despite the blood staining one sleeve of his coat. His rifle was cradled in his arms, his expression hidden in shadow. "Are you hurt?" Ruth asked, moving toward him. "I've had worse," he replied, his gaze shifting to the small figure behind her. "The boy's safe," Ruth assured him, frightened but unharmed. Stone nodded once, some tension leaving his shoulders. "Webster, at the church, with his men. Mayor Harmon stayed behind to delay them." Something like respect flickered across Stone's face. "Harmon's full of surprises." "Yes," Ruth agreed softly. "He told me everything, Jed. About Emily, about—" She hesitated, glancing at Thomas, who was watching their exchange with wide eyes. "About your son." Stone went very still, his gaze locked on the child. "My son is dead," he said, but the words lacked conviction. Ruth placed a gentle hand on his arm. "No, he isn't." In the silver wash of moonlight, she watched the truth dawn in Stone's eyes, hope and disbelief warring with years of grief. He took a half step forward, then stopped, as if afraid the boy might vanish if approached too quickly. "Thomas," he whispered the name, a prayer on his lips. The boy stared up at him, uncertainty written in every line of his small body. Then slowly he nodded. Stone sank to one knee in the snow, bringing himself to the child's level. He made no move to touch him, simply waited, his scarred face vulnerable, in a way Ruth had never seen before. "You've grown," he said softly, "but your eyes, they're still your mother's." Thomas took a hesitant step forward, then another. His hand reached out, touching the scar on Stone's face with gentle curiosity. "Got that at Gettysburg," Stone explained, his voice rough with emotion. "Long before you were born." The boy's fingers traced the line of the scar, then moved to something hanging around the Stone's neck, a small brass key on a leather cord similar to the one Ruth wore. "You remember?" Stone asked, hope brightening his voice. "Your mother had one just like it, said it was the key to our hearts." Thomas nodded, his face solemn in the moonlight. Then with deliberate care, he reached into his coat and withdrew a slate. On it, he wrote a single word, "Father." Stone made a sound that might have been a laugh or a sob quickly stifled. "Yes," he confirmed, "though I haven't been much of one these past years." Thomas shook his head emphatically, then wrote, "Not your fault." The simple absolution seemed to break something in Stone. He opened his arms, a silent invitation that Thomas accepted without hesitation, stepping into his father's embrace for the first time in 3 years. Ruth watched through tears as the two held each other, the moonlight casting them in silver, a tableau of reunion that seemed too fragile for the harsh world that had torn them apart. The moment was shattered by the distant sound of hoofbeats, Webster and his men, having dealt with Harmon, now on their trail. Stone rose, lifting Thomas in one fluid motion. "We need to move," he said, his voice regaining its customary steel. "They'll be following our tracks in the snow." Ruth nodded, retrieving the map from her pocket. "Mayor Harmon gave me this. Said there's a military train leaving Fort Harrison at dawn. We have papers to board it." Stone studied the map briefly, then shook his head. "Too obvious. Webster will expect that. We need to disappear where he won't think to look." Where? A grim smile touched Stone's lips. "The old mine." Ruth blinked in surprise. "A mine isn't that dangerous. Less dangerous than being caught in open country with Webster on our trail." Stone shifted Thomas to a more secure position in his arms. "The entrance is hidden. We can shelter there until they give up the search." With no better alternative, Ruth followed as Stone led them away from the creek, angling northwest through increasingly rugged terrain. The going was difficult, the snow deeper here where wind had drifted it against rock outcroppings. Thomas eventually squirmed to be put down, insisting on walking himself. Stone complied but kept a hand on the boy's shoulder, steadying him over the roughest patches. They traveled in watchful silence, alert for any sign of pursuit. Stone set a pace that challenged Ruth's endurance, but she made no complaint, understanding the urgency driving him. Dawn was a pale suggestion on the eastern horizon when they reached the mine entrance, a narrow fissure in a rocky hillside nearly invisible beneath an overhang of stone and tangled brush. "Found this place my first year here," Stone explained, clearing debris from the opening. "Previous owner abandoned it when the vein played out. Most folks have forgotten it exists." The entrance widened into a rough-hewn tunnel shored up with timbers that creaked ominously as they passed. Ruth tried to quell her instinctive fear of the close darkness, focusing instead on Stone's confident movements ahead of her. The tunnel opened into a larger chamber, where a shaft of early morning light penetrated through a narrow chimney in the rock above. Stone lit a lantern he produced from a cache of supplies stacked against one wall. "You've prepared this place," Ruth observed, noting the bedroll's provisions, even a small stove for heat. "I prepare everywhere I might need to shelter," Stone replied simply. "Habit from the war." Thomas explored the chamber with evident curiosity, examining the rock walls and the abandoned mining equipment scattered about. He seemed untroubled by the underground space, his earlier fear apparently forgotten in the security of his father's presence. Stone busied himself lighting the stove while Ruth organized their meager provisions. The small domestic tasks felt surreal after the night's dangers and revelations, yet there was comfort in their normalcy. "Will Webster find us here?" Ruth asked quietly when Thomas had wandered to the far side of the chamber, absorbed in examining a collection of quartz crystals embedded in the wall. "Eventually, perhaps," Stone admitted, "but not before we've rested and planned our next move." "And what is our next move? We can't hide in a mine forever." Stone's gray eyes met hers directly. "No, but we can't outrun Webster forever either. At some point I'll have to face him." Ruth's heart constricted with fear. "You said yourself he has men with him. You'd be outnumbered." "Not necessarily." Stone's gaze shifted to his son. "Harmon mentioned a witness to Jacob's murder, someone who could testify against the mining company and against Webster." Ruth followed his gaze, understanding dawning. "Thomas," she whispered, "he saw it all." "He did, and if we could get him to Helena, to the territorial governor—" "He can't speak," Ruth reminded him. "How would he testify?" "He can write," Stone countered, "and there's a judge in Helena who owes me a favor. A man who's been trying to break the mining company's grip on territorial politics for years." Ruth considered this. "It's dangerous." "Yes, but sometimes the only way out of danger is through it." Stone's expression softened as he watched his son. "And Thomas deserves a life where he doesn't have to hide or run, where he can be a boy again, not a fugitive." The simple truth of this statement resonated deeply with Ruth. She thought of her own disrupted childhood, of the moment her mother's death had thrust her into premature adulthood. No child should have to carry such burdens. "We'll help him," she agreed softly. "Together." Stone's gaze returned to her, something warming in his gray eyes. "You don't have to, Ruth. This isn't your fight. It became my fight the moment you knelt in the dirt instead of claiming what you'd paid for," she replied steadily. "And it's certainly my fight now." A hint of a smile touched the corner of Stone's mouth. "You're a remarkable woman, Ruth Adams." The compliment warmed her more than it should have given their circumstances. Before she could respond, Thomas returned to them, his slate in hand. On it, he'd written a single question. Now what Stone considered his son gravely. "Now we rest," he said, "and then if you're willing, we fight back." Thomas nodded solemnly, then added to his slate for mother. "Yes," Stone agreed, his voice rough with emotion. "For your mother, and for you." The boy seemed satisfied with this answer. He settled beside the stove, his small face thoughtful as he watched the flames through the iron grate. They rested through the day, taking turns standing watch at the mine entrance. No sign of Webster or his men appeared, but Stone's vigilance never wavered. He cleaned and checked his weapons with methodical precision, prepared for whatever might come. As dusk approached, Thomas fell asleep on one of the bedrolls, exhaustion finally claiming him. Stone covered him with a blanket, his touch gentle as he smoothed the dark hair from his son's forehead. "He has her eyes," he said quietly to Ruth, who sat nearby. "And her spirit too, I think." "Tell me about her," Ruth invited. "About Emily." Stone was silent for so long, Ruth thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice had softened with memory. "She loved music, played the violin like she was born to it, said it was the voice of everything she couldn't put into words." His gaze drifted to the silent violin in its case back at the cabin. "Taught music to the neighbor children before Thomas was born, after she'd play him to sleep every night." Ruth smiled, imagining the scene, a mother's love expressed through melody, a father's pride watching them both. "She sounds wonderful," she said sincerely. She was. Stone's expression grew distant. "Too good for the life I gave her. Always moving, always watching over our shoulders. The bounty hunting, it paid well, but it brought dangers I didn't fully appreciate until too late." "You couldn't have known what would happen," Ruth offered gently. "No, but I should have been there." The old guilt resurfaced in his voice. "Should have protected them." "You're protecting Thomas now," Ruth reminded him. "That's what matters." Stone nodded, his gaze returning to his sleeping son. "Yes, and I won't fail him again." The conviction in his voice left no room for doubt. Whatever came next, Jedediah Stone would defend his child with everything he possessed, including his life if necessary. As night settled fully over the mountains, they finalized their plan. They would travel to Helena by an indirect route, avoiding the main trails where Webster might set ambushes. Stone knew a judge there, a man named Hollister, who had been fighting the mining company's corrupt practices for years. "If we can get Thomas to him, get his testimony recorded officially, it could break the company's power," Stone explained, "and ensure Webster faces justice for what he's done." "Will Thomas be safe afterward?" Ruth asked, her primary concern, always for the child's welfare. "Hollister has connections in Washington. Could arrange protection, perhaps even a new start somewhere far from Montana." Stone's expression tightened. "Though I'd prefer to stay and see this through to the end." "You mean see Webster hang?" Ruth said, not a question. Stone didn't deny it. "Justice takes many forms, Miss Adams." The formality was a step back from the intimacy they'd shared earlier, a reminder of the gulf between Stone's world of violence and vengeance and Ruth's gentler existence. Yet she found she understood his thirst for justice, even shared it to some degree. "What about Mayor Harmon?" she asked, changing the subject. "And the Wilsons, should we try to find them?" Stone's expression darkened. "If Harmon survived his stand at the church, he'll make his way to Helena on his own. As for the Wilsons," he hesitated. "When I left, Theodore was wounded but alive. Martha was tending him. Their farmhouse was intact." Ruth nodded, relief washing through her. She'd grown fond of the elderly couple in their brief acquaintance. "Rest now," Stone advised, moving toward the mine entrance for his watch. "We leave before dawn." Ruth settled on her bedroll, bone-weary, yet too alert with anticipation for easy sleep. Beside her, Thomas slumbered peacefully. One small hand curled around the wooden soldier he'd found at the church. She studied the boy's face in repose, noting the features he shared with his father, the determined set of his jaw, the straight brows. Yet there was softness, too, a gentleness inherited from the mother he'd lost so tragically. "We'll keep you safe," she promised silently. "Whatever it takes." She must have dozed eventually, for she woke to Stone's hand on her shoulder, his voice low in her ear. "Time to go," he murmured, "while the night still gives us cover." They prepared quickly, gathering their few possessions in the lantern's dim glow. Thomas woke alert and ready, helping pack provisions with practiced efficiency. Outside, the night was clear and cold, stars brilliant in the black vault of sky. Stone led them along a ridge that offered solid footing while keeping them below the skyline, invisible to watchers below. They traveled steadily through the remaining hours of darkness, making good time across the rugged landscape. Stone moved with the confidence of one who knew the land intimately, finding paths where none seemed to exist. Dawn found them descending into a sheltered valley where a small stream cut through the snow-covered ground. Stone called a brief halt, allowing them to rest and eat while he scouted ahead. "How far to Helena?" Ruth asked when he returned. "2 days at this pace," he replied, helping Thomas refill a canteen from the stream. "Less if we risk the main trail, but too dangerous," Ruth finished for him. "I understand." They continued their journey as the sun climbed higher, warming the air enough to make the snow treacherous underfoot. Progress slowed as they navigated increasingly difficult terrain, Stone choosing routes that offered concealment over ease of travel. By midday, Ruth's legs ached with fatigue, but she pressed on without complaint. Thomas, too, showed remarkable endurance for one so young, though Stone occasionally carried him across the most challenging stretches. They were traversing a narrow ledge above a steep ravine when Stone suddenly raised his hands, signaling for absolute stillness. Ruth froze, heart pounding, as he dropped to a crouch, scanning the valley below. "Riders," he murmured, "3 of them following the main trail." Ruth pulled Thomas close, feeling his small body tense against hers. Webster Stone nodded grimly, and 2 others, moving fast toward Helena. "They're ahead of us," Ruth observed, fear tightening her throat. "Will they set an ambush?" "Likely," Stone confirmed, "which means we change our approach." He studied the terrain ahead, considering options. "There's an old trapper I know, lives about 5 miles east of here. Might give us shelter for the night, maybe lend us horses. Can he be trusted?" "Old Josiah trusts no one and expects the same in return," Stone replied with a hint of a smile. "But he hates the mining companies more than he dislikes company. Lost his son in the collapse that killed Jacob and the others." This new plan decided they altered course, leaving the ridge for a deer trail that wound through dense forest. The going was easier here, protected from the wind that had begun to rise as afternoon waned. Thomas walked between them now, occasionally taking Ruth's hand when the path narrowed. She marveled at the child's resilience, how quickly he'd adapted to their presence, how bravely he faced each new challenge. "He's extraordinary," she said softly to Stone when Thomas had moved ahead to examine a fox track in the snow. "His mother's son," Stone replied, but pride warmed his voice. The trapper's cabin appeared just as dusk was falling, a low, smoke-blackened structure nestled against a cliff face nearly invisible until they were upon it. A thin spiral of smoke rose from its stone chimney, the only sign of habitation. Stone approached openly, hands visible, calling out a greeting. For several tense moments, nothing happened. Then the cabin's door creaked open, revealing a grizzled figure with a shotgun braced against one shoulder. "Stone," the man acknowledged, his voice a rusty growl. "Heard you was dead." "Rumors," Stone replied evenly. "Need shelter, Josiah, for the night only." The old trapper's gaze shifted to Ruth and Thomas, suspicion giving way to grudging acceptance. "Company's gone soft if they're sending women and children after you now." "Not company men," Stone corrected. "Friends." Josiah snorted but lowered his shotgun. "Ain't had friends in this cabin since '62. But come in if you've a mind to. Night's falling cold." The cabin's interior was surprisingly spacious, with furs lining the walls and floor. A fire burned in a stone hearth, casting dancing shadows across the rough-hewn furnishings. Josiah proved taciturn but hospitable in his way, sharing a stew of rabbit and wild onions and offering Ruth the cabin's only chair. He watched Thomas with undisguised curiosity, but asked no questions about the boy's silence. Later, when Thomas had fallen asleep on a pile of furs near the fire, the old trapper finally spoke directly to Stone. "Company men been through here," he said without preamble. "Yesterday, asking after a boy." Stone's expression didn't change, but Ruth saw his hand move imperceptibly closer to his gun. "What did you tell them?" "That the only boys around here got 4 legs and fur," Josiah replied with a dry chuckle. "They didn't linger, but they left this." He produced a folded paper from his pocket, handing it to Stone. Ruth leaned closer to see a crude drawing of Thomas, accompanied by text offering $50 for information leading to his capture. The words "escaped indentured apprentice" suggested the mining company's official story. "They're desperate," Stone observed, his voice cold. $50 is a fortune in these parts." Josiah spat into the fire. "Not enough to buy old Josiah's tongue, not after what they did to my Elijah." He glanced at the sleeping Thomas. "Boy's important, I reckon." "He witnessed a murder," Stone replied simply. "One the company doesn't want brought to light." The trapper nodded, requiring no further explanation. In the territories, justice often hinged on such simple equations. "Need horses," Stone continued. "Ours were lost when Webster attacked the Wilson place." "Got 2 you can use," Josiah offered. "Not much to look at, but they'll get you where you're going." He fixed Stone with a penetrating stare. "Which is where exactly, Helena, Judge Hollister?" Josiah considered this, then nodded approvingly. "Good man Hollister. Straight as they come. But getting to him won't be easy. Company's got men watching his office, his home." "We'll find a way," Stone assured him. The old trapper studied Stone's face, then Ruth's, before his gaze settled on Thomas. Boys worth dying for. Yes, Stone and Ruth answered simultaneously. A rare smile creased Josiah's weathered face. Then you'll need more than horses. He rose, moving to a trunk in the corner of the cabin. From it, he withdrew a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. Been saving this for a reckoning of my own, but sounds like yours is coming sooner. He unwrapped the bundle to reveal a Sharps rifle and a box of ammunition. Military issue, accurate to 600 yards in the right hands. He offered it to Stone. Your hands always were steady. Stone accepted the weapon with appropriate gravity. I'll return it when this is done. Josiah waved this away. Keep it. Or give it to the boy when he's grown. Teach him to hunt deer, not men. His gaze grew distant. That's what I should have done with Elijah. Kept him away from the mines. The old man's regret hung heavy in the cabin's close air. Ruth thought of her own regrets, of paths not taken, of choices made in desperation rather than hope. You should rest, Josiah advised, breaking the somber mood. Leave at first light. Company men patrol the main trails after dawn. They settled for the night, Ruth on a pallet of furs near Thomas Stone, keeping watch by the door, despite Josiah's assurance that his traps would warn of any approach. Sleep eluded Ruth, her mind too full of the dangers that lay ahead. Helena was still 2 days' journey even with horses. Webster and his men were already there, likely setting traps, watching for them. Yet beneath her fear ran a current of fierce determination. Thomas deserved justice. He deserved a childhood free from fear, a future where he could find his voice again, literally and figuratively. And Stone Ruth glanced to where he sat, his profile stern. In the dying firelight, he deserved redemption. A chance to be the father he'd been denied being for 3 long years. As for herself, Ruth wasn't sure what she deserved or wanted, only that she was committed to seeing this through, whatever the cost. Dawn arrived with a sky heavy with snow clouds, a mixed blessing. Fresh snow would make tracking them more difficult, but would slow their progress as well. Josiah provided them with provisions and directions to a little-used trail that would take them to Helena via a circuitous but safer route. The horses he offered were indeed unimpressive to look at, one a dun gelding past his prime, the other a piebald mare with a Roman nose, but both appeared sound and willing. Remember, the old trapper advised as they prepared to depart. Hollister's usually at the courthouse till sundown. After that, he takes his supper at the Helena house, always sits by the east window. Stone nodded, committing the information to memory. Thank you, Josiah, for everything. The old man waved this away, his attention focusing on Thomas, who sat before Stone on the dun gelding. You remember what your pa teaches you, boy, he said gruffly, about shooting and about living. Both harder than they look. Thomas nodded solemnly, then startled them all by reaching out to grasp Josiah's gnarled hand in his small one. The gesture seemed to affect the old trapper deeply, for he turned away quickly, muttering about checking his trap line. They set out as the first snowflakes began to fall, heading northeast along the hidden trail Josiah had indicated. The horses proved sure-footed, despite the deteriorating conditions, maintaining a steady pace that ate up miles. Stone rode slightly ahead, the Sharps rifle across his saddle, alert for any sign of danger. Ruth followed with Thomas, now seated before her on the piebald mare, his small body warm against hers. The snow intensified as the day progressed, reducing visibility to a few yards at times. They pushed on, guided more by Stone's instinct than any visible trail. By midday, they'd covered perhaps 10 miles, good progress given the weather, but still far from their destination. They paused briefly in the shelter of a rock outcropping, sharing jerky and hardtack from their provisions. Thomas huddled close to Ruth, his face pinched with cold despite the heavy scarf wrapped around his neck and lower face. We should find better shelter soon, Ruth suggested to Stone, concern for the boy foremost in her mind. Stone nodded, surveying the white wilderness around them. There's a line shack about 3 miles ahead, used by cattle drovers in summer. Should be empty now. This goal established, they remounted and continued their journey, the falling snow quickly obscuring their tracks behind them. The wind had risen, driving the snow horizontally, at times stinging exposed skin like tiny needles. Ruth found herself humming to maintain her spirits the same lullaby she'd sung to Thomas at the trapper's cabin. To her surprise, the boy began to move his fingers against her arm, in time with the melody, as if playing an invisible instrument. Do you like music, Thomas? She asked, bending close to his ear to be heard above the wind. He nodded enthusiastically, then mime drawing a bow across strings. Like your mother's violin, Ruth realized aloud. You remember her playing. Another nod, this one accompanied by a wistful expression that tugged at Ruth's heart. She tightened her arm around him, offering what comfort she could. Perhaps we can find you a violin of your own someday, she suggested, when this is all over. And Thomas twisted to look up at her, his blue eyes bright with an emotion Ruth couldn't quite name. Hope, perhaps, or simple gratitude for the acknowledgement that there would be a future beyond their current peril. The line shack, when they finally reached it, proved to be little more than a single room with a dirt floor and a rusty stove. Yet it offered blessed relief from the driving snow and wind. Stone quickly built a fire while Ruth helped Thomas out of his wet outer garments. We'll stay until the storm passes, Stone decided, surveying their meager shelter. Pushing on in this would be foolish. Ruth agreed, though she worried about the delay. Every hour gave Webster more time to prepare for their arrival in Helena. The remainder of the day passed slowly, confined as they were to the shack's small interior. Thomas napped for a time, exhausted by the journey. Stone maintained his vigilance at the single window, watching the snow continue to fall in an impenetrable white curtain. Do you think Webster will guess we're coming to Helena? Ruth asked quietly as she prepared a simple meal from their provisions. Stone considered this. Eventually, but he'll expect us to avoid the town to try to reach the territorial governor or federal authorities elsewhere. Why do you trust Judge Hollister to help us when so many others are corrupted by the mining company? Because he lost his daughter to consumption brought on by mine dust, Stone replied grimly. She was a school teacher in a company town, breathed the stuff for years before it killed her. Ruth nodded, understanding the personal stake that might make the judge immune to bribes or threats. And once Thomas's testimony is recorded, what then? Stone's expression softened as he glanced at his sleeping son. Then we start over. Somewhere new. Somewhere he can be safe. The three of us, Ruth asked the question, slipping out before she could reconsider. Stone looked at her directly, something warming in his gray eyes. If that's what you want, Ruth, you have earned the right to choose your own path forward. The simple acknowledgement of her agency, her right to determine her own future, meant more to Ruth than any flowery declaration might have. In this man who had knelt rather than claim ownership of her, she had found someone who truly saw her as an equal. I'd like that, she admitted softly, to help Thomas, to see what kind of life we might build. Stone didn't smile, he rarely did, but the tension around his eyes eased slightly. Then that's what we'll do, once this is finished. The unspoken condition hung between them. If we survive what's coming. Night fell, the storm's fury gradually subsiding to a gentle, steady snowfall. Stone insisted on taking first watch, though Ruth doubted anyone could have tracked them through the blizzard. She slept fitfully, waking often to check on Thomas, who slumbered peacefully beside her, his face relaxed in sleep in a way it seldom was while awake. Sometime in the deepest part of night, Ruth woke to find Stone seated on the floor beside them, his scarred hand gently stroking his son's dark hair. The tenderness in the gesture brought tears to her eyes. This fierce, dangerous man, reduced to wonder by the simple miracle of his child's return. Stone sensed her wakefulness and met her gaze in the dying firelight. No words were necessary. The shared vigil over Thomas's sleep created a bond between them that transcended conventional relationships. In that moment, Ruth knew with absolute certainty that whatever dangers awaited them in Helena, they would face them together, not as protector and protected, but as partners in a common cause. As family, perhaps, of a kind neither of them had dared hope for again. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the wild country in pristine white nature's absolution, covering the tracks of the past, offering the promise of a clean page upon which to write a new story. A story that would begin, Ruth prayed, with justice in Helena, and end with peace for the boy who slept between them, unaware of the depth of love that surrounded him in this humble shelter on the edge of civilization.